I'm going to be taking you through all three stages of your PVM journey, from tackling noob-friendly bosses like Scurrius, breaking into real money-making PVM with bosses like Zulrah and Vorkath, and finally dipping your toes into the endgame and how to get started with raids. Before we get started, let me know in the comments below the boss that's helped you learn the game and progress your account the most. And if you're a regular viewer and want to see more content like this, drop me a subscription, it really helps out the channel. PVM in OSRS is more accessible than ever. There have been so many massive additions to the game that make your transition from a lowly noob to a top tier boss killer a pretty seamless journey, as long as you know which bosses you should be killing to learn all of the skills you need before diving into the tougher stuff. Don't let the weirdos that talk about endgame content like it's some kind of unachievable superhuman feat fool you. Anything is achievable for pretty much anyone in this game with the right preparation and enough practice. A lot has changed about the early game in Old School RuneScape in recent years, so regardless of if you're a straight up noob or a high level player who's been around a while and never properly delved into PVM, this video is going to be useful to you. I've played this game for 20 years, but I've only started tackling bosses in the past year or so I know how daunting it can be to get out of that comfort zone of questing and skilling. Let's talk about the first rung on the ladder for any player, Scurrius. Scurrius is the Rat King boss sneaking around under Varrock sewers. If you've got a combat level of at least 70, you should be more than capable of getting the most out of this boss. You can fight him in a public instance as a group, which is awesome if you're playing with friends as a main or as a group Iron Man, or if you're just learning. However, the solo instance is where he really shines and you can sink your teeth into mastering some of OSRS's most essential mechanics. Something unique about Scurrius is that as well as being a great teaching tool, he's also a great training method. He's got a flat 20% XP increase for all damage done, and also drops Scurrius spines which can be crafted into rat bone weapons, which provide a massive damage boost when killing him. Once you've got the rat weapons for all three styles, you can also trade these spines in for pure XP. As for the useful stuff he's going to teach you, you'll become very familiar with one of RuneScape's core mechanics, prayer switching. For a section of the fight, this greedy bastard will leave you alone and smash the cheese on the edge of the room. His little mates on his back haven't forgotten about you though, and they'll be blasting you with magic attacks and some kind of ranged attack that looks to be some kind of weird cheese stink blast. I have no idea, but either way, you're going to need to be switching between protect from range and protect from magic. If you're looking at getting your first fire cape as you enter the mid-game, which you definitely should be, this is essential learning for the spicy Jad fight at the end of the fight caves. The other skill you'll learn is another one crucial to RuneScape's core mechanics. Don't stand in the shit on the floor. Scurrius will jump, bricks will fall from the sky, and you'll see a shadow where they're about to land. If you're currently standing in the shadow, move. This sounds simple, but when you're managing other things like prayers and health, it's easy to get caught out. This kind of mechanic is used at multiple bosses through the endgame raids and other mid-game, endgame money-making bosses like the Phantom Muspah and Vardorvis, as well as many more. The final useful mechanic is the little rat minions he summons. When you have a rat bane weapon, you can one-tick this. This means getting an attack in every 0.6 seconds, and you could attack a new rat instead of having to wait for your standard weapon speed timer. This has direct carryover to tough fights like the Phase 3 Wardens in Tombs of Amascut, and is indirectly useful in so many other places. You have to learn to deal with these mechanics to tackle pretty much any modern boss in Old School RuneScape. Scurrius is a great place to do this, as the consequences are pretty low if you mess up, taking a little bit of damage instead of getting absolutely spanked by nasty one-shot kills. The next boss we'll tackle is Amoxliatl. She's quite hidden away in Varlamore and requires the Heart of Darkness to be completed before you can take her on, but she's just as useful as Scurrius in learning some essential skills. One of my favourite things about this boss is the pendant and tears she drops. The pendant can be charged with the tears to allow you to teleport just outside the boss arena. Really useful as it's in a pretty remote corner of the world. If you didn't get enough of dodging the shit on the floor during the Scurrius fight, you will now. This is really going to hammer home that essential skill. The main difference between this fight and the prior one is that instead of the bricks falling in random locations, this time Amoxliatl will spawn pools of icy water. Most of these will be random, but one is guaranteed to be on your player's current spot. This is obviously useful from a perspective of practicing movement and pathing mechanics around the other pools of ice, but it's also great for getting to grips with the concept that RuneScape is a rhythm game in disguise and learning to get into the rhythm of the fight. If you watch any of my full boss guides with the live commentary, I'll also go through the rhythm of the fight. I've got a full video on both of these bosses, so they're worth checking out if you're feeling encouraged to give them a go. Amoxliatl has a special icicle attack that will switch off your prayer, which you'll need to switch back on. This is exactly the same as Vorkath's purple dragon fire, something you'd need to deal with in Dragon Slayer 2, and also if you want to kill Vorkath later on for money. It's also pretty similar to the Vardorvis head mechanic, which was the biggest hurdle for me when trying to complete Desert Treasure 2. The other attack also has some crossover from Scurrius, one ticking the ice blocks. All you're doing is clicking on these very quickly, but it really hammers home the importance of timing and precision. RuneScape is obviously thematically a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, but in its mechanics it's got more in common with rhythm games like Guitar Hero and first-person shooters, with click accuracy and timing being the keys to success. If you want to get towards endgame content, there's no point grinding out all of the old classic bosses, stuff like the King Black Dragon, Chaos Elemental and Calfight Queen. Whilst these can be fun for their own reasons and have cool pets and some unique drops, you're better off spending your time with bosses that have some challenging mechanics, rather than bosses like those who are essentially just massive tanky damage sponges with huge max hits. Come back to these guys when you've got big stats and epic gear yourself, otherwise I promise you will end up very frustrated. When I first started my PVM journey, I tried to kill the Calfight Queen in full Verax and was getting one kill every 10 minutes. I was not having fun. The other thing to avoid is worrying too much about costs and profit. When learning a new boss, you will die and lose money initially. I lost a couple million gold trying to juke Succulus. That soon became very irrelevant when I got a drop worth 60 mil. Now I know the fight so well that it never catches me out, and even if I'm not getting the big ticket drops, it's pure profit after my supply costs. Now you're well practiced and you've learnt the basic mechanics from the newer noob friendly bosses, let's get started with the best ways to break into the mid game. There are plenty of brain-dead ways to make money in old school RuneScape, but for the sake of your sanity and the efficient progression of your account, you probably want to kill two birds with one stone and tackle some of the lucrative mid-game bosses. This is not only going to make you bank, but it's going to teach you some of the essential skills that you're going to need to tackle harder content in the future, be that content like the Inferno or the Colosseum for untradeable endgame best-in-slot items, or raids for massive game-changing mega rare drops. Don't let any of the videos by the top level players or guides on the wiki fool you. These are all written by sweats in max gear that don't tackle anything unless they're in the optimal setup. All the content I'm going to be showing you today is achievable and farmable with much more budget friendly gear. I've got in-depth guides for all of these bosses, so make sure to check them out if you want much more thorough advice on the mechanics and the gear you should be bringing with you. Before we get to the endgame stuff, we're going to need some game knowledge and the gear. That comes with practice and money, and the content I'm going to be talking about today will cover all the bases you need to build upon the solid foundation that we looked at in our beginner's guide to PVM. The mid-game has had so much awesome stuff added in 2024, so we'll be looking at some recent content, but some of the old favourites are still unbelievably consistent money makers and great for your first real boss grind. You'll have plenty of options to choose from depending on what quest you've done and your preferred combat style. Let's get stuck in with the first bit of content that's really going to show you the ropes of what PVM is all about. The Moons of Peril is the spiritual successor to an iconic piece of content in RuneScape, the Barrows. There are 3 bosses that you'll need to tackle. There are a few reasons this content is incredible for the mid-level player. The first being that you need no consumable items to get kills on this boss, meaning the drops you get from the loot chest at the end are pure profit. You can boost your stats and restore health and prayer with the potions and food obtainable in the boss area. You'll be running through caves where you can fish, hunt, collect bugs and replenish your resources, and even refresh your run energy by stopping for a quick cup of tea. Speaking of making pure profit, you can expect to make between 2 and 3 mil per hour. This boss is pretty reliant on getting the unique drops, so hold out until you get some of the big ticket items. Blood Moon tassets are the priciest drop, sitting at around 11 mil right now. You'll get some steady cash too, trickling in from the herbs, seeds, bones and other materials. As this encounter is broken up into 3 bosses, you're going to be learning so many transferable skills. With the Blue Moon, learning to dodge the tornadoes properly is going to teach you so much about movement and timing. It's also a great demonstration of an interesting quirk in the OSRS running mechanics. When you're walking, you move one tile every tick. If you're unfamiliar with the tick system, RuneScape basically registers every input and position every 0.6 seconds. If you're walking, you move one tile every 0.6 seconds. If you run, you move 2 tiles and your character is never actually registered as being on the central tile, even though that's where he appears to be in the animation. The True Tile plugin demonstrates this really well. I strongly advise using it to get to grips with this system. You can use this knowledge to your advantage and run through some of the tornadoes that would usually be damaging if you just walk through them. On the Eclipse Moon, using the shield to block the Eclipse Moon's attacks is very similar to using the shield in the Zook fight at the end of the Inferno. I've never actually done the Inferno, but I've tried simulators for practice, and the only real difference I can see is that you're moving in a square instead of a straight line, which I think is actually harder, and that you can't get any attacks on the boss during the shield phase. There is no other mechanic in this game like this that I know of, so it's the best introduction that you're going to get. The Blood Moon has the Blood Jaguars. This has some carryover to the belly bouncing mechanic in the Verzik fight in the Theatre of Blood. It's useful, but Theatre of Blood entry mode is the real secret for learning that fight for sure. Next up, we've got a classic money printer, Vorkath. Vorkath is super consistent, with superior dragon bones being a massive source of the money, but fairly common dragon items, rune items, as well as crafting and fletching materials, herbs, seeds, and other bits and bobs boosting up your profit. Expect between 3 and 5 mil per hour depending on your gear and stats. The biggest catch with Vorkath is that it requires Dragon Slayer 2, a fairly tough, long quest, but certainly doable with a mid-game account. I've got a guide on the final boss, Galvek, so if you're scared of taking him on, make sure to check that out. Once you've got the quest out of the way though, you should have no trouble with Vorkath. If you've already been tackling great beginner bosses like Scurrius and Amoxliatl, you should have had the exposure to most of the required mechanics. Turning your prayer back on when it gets switched off, dodging the falling fireballs, all having massive crossover from these earlier bosses. The new main thing you can learn from this fight is the Wook's Walk, invented by the man himself, to keep damage consistent whilst on the move. There are both ranged and melee methods, but as a quick overview, I'll demonstrate the melee method as I find it easier to demonstrate what's going on. There are plenty of YouTubers better than me that can show you the range method. During the acid phase, you'll need to keep moving consistently to avoid the fireballs. Depending on your weapon speed, you'll be clicking away from the boss and then clicking back on the boss with the right timing. You'll need to make sure that you click away again as soon as your true tile touches the boss, so that you don't get held on this spot for any length of time. If you get held there, you'll get hit by the fireball. This is a great transferable skill at every boss where you'll need to move and attack at the same time, and it's a great place to learn it because you'll have that instant feedback of getting slapped by the fireballs if you mess it up. It's a really great skill to have at the next boss I'll be showing you, the Phantom Muspah. The profit range is similar to Vorkath, between 3 and 5 million per hour, but it's a lot less consistent and reliant on uniques, but not so much as the moons. You'll be holding out for those Venetus shards to really make the big money. For mid-level players, gear switching is the main skill you're going to be brushing up on in this fight. In max gear with mega rare weapons, you can range or mage this boss down, but realistically, you're going to want to bring both combat styles. Organising your inventory to make switches easy and practicing those fast clicks is essential in the end game. This boss will certainly punish you if your clicks aren't quick enough. Slow switches mean slow kills, which means more damage taken, and the more likely you are to die or run out of supplies. Keeping with the speed as the theme of this boss, you're going to need super fast prayer switches to protect from the hard-hitting magic attack and rapid movement to avoid the ground spikes. A mechanic that is fairly unique to Muspah is kiting him around the room in his melee phase. This is often used on older, tankier bosses like General Grador, or whilst going for certain combat achievements like in the Fight Caves or Inferno, but it's a bit of a niche skill. Knowing how to move monsters around when they have you targeted is definitely a useful tool to have in your toolbox. Next, we've got another classic moneymaker, Zulrah. It's a great mix of both consistent rewards and some pricey unique drops. You can expect around 2 to 4 million per hour here. Similar to Muspah, you'll need to range and mage switch for a mid-level account. It's another great place to practice those speedy switches. However, I think the main takeaway from Zulrah is that even though you can avoid a lot of the damage with the correct prayers and movement, there are still phases where you can get comboed out pretty hard. Being aware of the boss's max hit and just how quickly it can kill you is essential in every RuneScape boss. It sounds obvious, but when you know a boss can hit you for 40, sitting below 40 HP is probably a bad idea. Due to the speed of Zulrah's attacks and the fact that you can't block everything with prayer, it really keeps you on your toes managing your resources. I think the best way to tackle any content is to watch a few quick videos and just give it a go. You'll probably die a few times, but the cost of death is nothing in comparison to the money you'll be making once you master the mechanics and get that sweet loot. Don't let guides put you off. Most of the pro players will be recommending the best gear, but there's also a few creators like myself that will give you reasonable options on budget. Too many people don't even try content because they haven't got the perfect gear yet, when in reality, the best way to get that gear is to earn the money doing the bosses sub-optimally. There is an intended progression ladder, with bosses like Amoxliatl and Scurrius being great for learning the essential techniques, and the bosses covered in this guide great for developing them further. But I didn't use these to learn, and neither did the people who've been around a long time. You can throw yourself at any content and pick it up with enough patience. Speaking of patience, now we've geared up a bit with our massive loot from bosses like Perilous Moons, we can really begin to get our feet wet with some endgame content. We'll be going over a few major pieces of content that will absolutely change the way you play OSRS, and they're all absolutely ridiculous for building up your game knowledge and competency. One of these is absolutely hated by the elitist weirdos in the high-level community due to how easy it makes getting into endgame content. I think all of this content sits firmly in the upper mid-game, but could be considered the first step into the endgame by some players. Either way, it's a big leap forward from the bosses in the previous section of this mini-series. The first bit of content we'll be talking about is entry mode Tombs of Amascut. Whilst TOA can be certainly considered an endgame raid, entry mode is doable in even the most modest setup. If you have 100 combat and a bank value of 10 mil, you've certainly got the cash and the stats you need to start sending this and learning those essential skills and mechanics. The reason the sweats hate TOA so much is because it makes making PVM accessible to anyone with its invocation system. If you're unfamiliar with it, basically you add modifiers that change the mechanics of the individual bosses and the raid as a whole, and as you do so, these bosses' stats increase with the raid level. This means you can tackle the bosses in their weakest form with as few mechanics as possible and add in tougher mechanics over time, slowly increasing the level. You can die in entry mode as many times as you like. I'm not sure on the rules for hardcore Iron Men because I'm not a sadistic weirdo that wants my life's work erased because my internet went down. So if you die in TOA and lose your red skull, don't blame me. If you do die in TOA, you'll get tasty honeyed locusts which act as a stackable food, prayer potion and super restore simultaneously. This basically means you can practice each boss as many times as you like, with no loss of cash or supplies, short of any repair costs, bolts, runes or charges used. I won't go into details on all of the mechanics, you can check out my full in-depth guide for that, but here's why these bosses are going to really help you up your game. Akka is the ultimate boss for quick gear and prayer switching. Barbar relies on quick reaction times for his falling rock attacks and perfect pathing knowledge for the boulder phase. Krondis has some interesting movement and pathing mechanics, as well as timing the exploding jugs correctly. Kefri is great for keeping you on your toes for that constant movement and dodging mechanics. The final Warden's fight is a bit of everything rolled into one. It's got prayer flicking, dodging attacks, one-ticking the extra enemies. It's absolute chaos, and in my opinion, even if it's not the hardest fight, it's the most well-rounded fight in the entire game that requires so many different skills to master. Even though you might see Tombs of Amascut as some very intimidating content, definitely give it a go. Even if you only get to grips with one or two of the bosses, those incremental gains will get you on the way to wherever you're trying to get to. The only two downsides of the tombs is that the puzzle rooms absolutely suck and that you won't be making much money in entry mode unless you get really lucky. If money's your main concern, the next batch of bosses will be right up your street. Before we talk about them, if you've made it this far, like the video, drop me a subscribe and comment down below with the guides you'd like to see next. The next group is a bit steeper in their difficulty, the Forgotten Four from Desert Treasure 2. If you're a sensible young man or woman and you've got on your quest cape, you'll have killed these guys once already as part of the quest. The repeatable versions you fight after have all the same mechanics, but have some boosted stats to toughen them up a bit. Duke is the easiest to tackle and a really unique boss with his prep phase. This does get a little tedious after a while, but it's a really great way to learn about pathing and your true tile position whilst dodging the falling debris and the laser eyes. The main phase of the fight is a great example of a concept I like to call RuneScape as a rhythm game. Whilst to the untrained eye, it might look like you're dodging the attacks as they occur, but if you know the timing and where to click, you could do most of this fight with your eyes closed. It's just about knowing the Duke's attack speed and where you need to be at certain times. Whilst Duke is all about rhythm, Vardorvis is the ultimate test of pure reactionary gameplay. Quick prayer flicks for the projectile attack, frequent moving for the axes, and the spam click for his tendril attack are all making for hectic gameplay. But if you get used to the pressure fighting this boss, the pace of pretty much every other fight in the game is going to feel like a leisurely walk in the park. Leviathan lies somewhere in between. It's massively rhythm focused due to the prayer switching series of attacks, but it's got a fairly unique mechanic too, in that the rhythm speeds up as you go through the fight. Only you decide when to reset the rhythm. Shooting him in the back with a shadow spell restarts his rhythm back to a slow series of attacks. This is great for beginners because if you're finding the speed overwhelming, you can just slow him down by shooting him in the back. And as you master the rhythm, you can drag out the phase for longer periods of time and get kills done quicker. Whisperer is the final boss of the four. She's quite similar to Vardorvis in that you're constantly multitasking on the prayers and the movement, but it's not too hectic. I found her quite easy to pick up, but the enrage phase can still get a bit chaotic if you mess it up. All of these bosses are super tough, so don't be disheartened if you die. You'll definitely lose some gold, but all it takes is one big drop from these guys and you've made it all back instantly. I hope this video has given you the confidence you need to give one of these bosses or Tombs of Amascut a try. They're great bits of content and really great stepping stones into the endgame of OSRS. There's plenty of other aspirational content that you should look at if you've already tackled these two areas or fancy giving something else a go. The Gauntlet is great because it's got 2 difficulty versions and has no consequences for dying and has no gear requirements. TOB entry mode is another great first step into raiding. It's too easy to be a direct step to normal Theatre of Blood, but it certainly gives you a great feel for what raiding is all about. Any boss with reasonably intricate mechanics is always going to help you get better. Click speed and accuracy are the most important things other than understanding the mechanics, so simply getting time behind the mouse is always going to help. This is honestly the stage of the game that I'm at right now, so I know how it feels to be struggling through some of this content. With a bit of expectation management and perseverance, you'll be sending it in no time. If you've made it to the end, you definitely owe me a sub. I've also got a new Discord set up with a link in the description, so join me in there if you want to meet like-minded players looking to progress together and tackle some of the tougher group content or just for a chat. Thanks for sticking around, I'll see you next time.